Some hearts spend a lifetime waiting to be truly seen. Clara Boone knows that feeling all too well, the quiet cowgirl with calloused hands who watches other women get chosen while she stays invisible. In the windswept plains of Coyote Bend, Clara can outshoot most men and work harder than any ranch hand. But none of that matters when you're always overlooked. She's made peace with being alone until Eli Bear Maddox rides into town. This giant of a man is gentle with horses and speaks in quiet tones that make her feel safe. Over shared campfires and long days, their friendship grows in comfortable silences. One evening under prairie stars, Clara jokes that he could have any woman he wants. His simple response changes everything. "I don't want different women. I want you." But when a cattle baron threatens her land and Eli's past catches up with them, they'll fight for a love neither thought they deserved. Can two wounded souls find the courage to choose each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered fence posts of the Boone Ranch as Clara pulled on her father's worn leather gloves. The supple hide, darkened by years of honest work, had molded to fit her hands perfectly, though they'd been made for fingers thicker and stronger than hers. She flexed her grip, feeling the familiar comfort of the gloves that had become as much a part of her daily ritual as the first cup of coffee or the gentle words she whispered to her horses. These gloves were all she had left of Thomas Boone, save for the land itself and the stubborn streak that had kept the family ranch running for 3 generations. He died 5 winters past, leaving Clara to tend 300 acres of grazing land that stretched toward the horizon like a brown gold sea. The gloves reminded her daily of his calloused palms, his patient way of teaching her to mend fence and gentle a spooked calf. And most importantly, his belief that a person's worth wasn't measured by their gender but by their grit. Clara walked toward the corral where her horses waited, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. The nearest neighbor was old Pete Morrison, whose spread bordered hers to the east, and even his ranch house was a good mile away. Beyond that lay the town of Coyote Bend, population 237 souls, most of whom had watched Clara grow from a scrappy girl in braids to the determined woman she'd become at 26. She wasn't what the men in town called beautiful. Her face was too angular, her skin too weathered by sun and wind, her hands too rough from rope and rain. The eligible bachelors of Coyote Bend preferred their women soft-spoken and soft-handed, the kind who knew their way around a kitchen better than a cattle pen. Women like Sarah Mitchell, the banker's daughter with her honey-colored curls and Sunday dresses, or Beth Ann Crawford, whose laugh sounded like wind chimes and whose skin stayed pale as milk despite the harsh prairie sun. Clara had learned early not to compete in that particular contest. Instead, she'd thrown herself into the work, becoming the finest rider and the most reliable rancher within 50 miles. She could deliver a breached calf, repair a windmill in a thunderstorm, and track strays across terrain that would challenge most men. But none of those skills attracted suitors to her door on Sunday afternoons. The horses nickered as she approached, and Clara felt her shoulders relax. Here, in the company of her animals, she never felt overlooked or lacking. Her mare, Sage, a steel-gray Mustang with intelligent eyes, pushed her velvet nose against Clara's shoulder in greeting. The horse had been wild once, impossible for most riders to handle, but Clara had seen something worth saving in those fierce brown eyes. "Morning, girl," Clara murmured, running her gloved hand along Sage's neck. Ready to check the north pasture. She saddled Sage with practiced efficiency, every movement economical and sure. The leather creaked familiarly as she adjusted the stirrups and checked the cinch. This was her world leather and horsehair, the scent of hay and the distant lowing of cattle. It was a good life, she told herself, a full life. She didn't need a man to complete it. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn or in the deepening shadows of evening, loneliness crept in like prairie wind through the gaps in the barn walls. She'd catch herself watching the couples in town, noting how Jake Stevens held his wife's elbow as they stepped down from their wagon, or how Doc Patterson's eyes still lit up when his bride of 30 years brought him his morning coffee. Clara would feel something twist in her chest, not quite envy, but a hollow ache for something she'd convinced herself she didn't want. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her morning reverie. Clara looked up to see Pete Morrison riding toward her fence line, his weathered face creased with what looked like excitement. Pete was 73 years old and had seen everything the plains could offer, so it took something significant to put that kind of energy in his stride. "Clara," he called out as he reached her fence, "you hear about Morrison's new hire?" She walked over to the fence, Sage following behind like a large, devoted dog. "Morrison? You mean your cousin's spread?" "That's right. Big outfit. Needs the hands." Pete pushed his hat back, revealing a strip of pale skin above his darkened forehead. "But this new fellow they brought in, Clara, I ain't never seen anything like him. They call him Bear." "Bear? Wait till you see him. Man's built like a mountain, taller than anyone I ever met, and broad as a barn door. But here's the peculiar thing." Pete leaned forward conspirationally. "Yesterday, I watched him spend near an hour gentling a spooked colt. Never raised his voice, never lost his patience, just stood there talking soft until that little horse walked right into his arms." Clara found herself intrigued, despite her usual indifference to town gossip. "Where's he from?" "Nobody knows for certain. Keeps to himself mostly. But Sarah Mitchell's been making eyes at him every chance she gets, and half the unmarried women in town have found excuses to ride past the Morrison place." Pete chuckled. "Course, he don't seem to notice them much." Something in Clara's chest tightened, not jealousy exactly, but a familiar resignation. Of course, the women would be interested. A mysterious stranger, strong and capable, would naturally draw their attention, and why shouldn't he be interested in return? Women like Sarah had so much more to offer than a sunburned cowgirl with dirt under her fingernails. "Well," Clara said, adjusting her hat brim lower over her eyes, "I'm sure he'll settle in just fine." Pete studied her face with the keen eyes of someone who'd known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. "You ought to meet him, Clara. Might surprise you." "I'm not looking to be surprised, Pete." The old rancher shook his head. "Your daddy, God rest him, always said you had enough stubbornness for 3 people. But he also said you had the biggest heart in the county, even if you kept it locked up tighter than a bank vault." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "My heart's doing just fine where it is." "If you say so." Pete straightened in his saddle. "But if you change your mind, they'll be bringing cattle through the South Pass tomorrow. Might be you'll cross paths natural-like." After Pete rode away, Clara tried to focus on her morning routine, but his words lingered. She'd built a life that made sense, that protected her from the kind of hurt that came from hoping for things beyond her reach. Men like this Bear would look at her and see exactly what every other man saw: a capable hand, a reliable neighbor, but not a woman worth courting. She mounted Sage and guided the mare toward the north pasture, where her cattle grazed in the morning sun. The familiar rhythm of the horse's gait and the vast openness of the land usually calmed her mind, but today felt different. There was a restlessness in the air, like the electric feeling that came before a thunderstorm. As she crested a low rise, Clara could see the Morrison ranch in the distance. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, and she could make out small figures moving around the corrals. Was one of them the mysterious Bear? Did it matter? She turned Sage away from the view and focused on counting her cattle, checking for any signs of sickness or injury. This was real work, important work. It had sustained her family for 3 generations and would continue long after any gossip about mysterious cowboys had faded. But as the morning wore on, Clara found her gaze drifting south more often than usual, toward the Morrison spread and whoever waited there. The prairie wind seemed to carry whispers of change, and despite her best efforts to ignore them, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that her carefully ordered world was about to shift in ways she couldn't control. By the time she rode back to her own ranch house, a modest but sturdy building her grandfather had constructed from local stone and timber, the sun was high, and the day had grown warm. Clara unsaddled Sage and turned her out to graze, then stood for a moment in the shade of the barn, looking out at her land. This was home. This was enough. It had to be. But the wind kept whispering, and somewhere in the distance, a new chapter of her story was beginning, whether she was ready for it or not. The surveyor's stakes appeared overnight, like a cluster of grave markers in Clara's east pasture. She discovered them the next morning while checking her fence line. Thin wooden posts, driven deep into the earth at precise intervals, each one bearing a small metal tag with numbers she didn't recognize. Clara dismounted and examined the nearest stake, her heart beginning to pound as the implications became clear. Someone had surveyed her land without permission, marking boundaries for purposes unknown. The stakes formed a line that cut straight through her best grazing land and included the natural spring that fed her cattle through the dry season. She counted 12 stakes in total, each one a violation of her property and her peace of mind. Clara pulled the first stake from the ground with both hands, the wood coming free with a satisfying crack. She moved methodically down the line, yanking each marker from the earth, until her arms ached and sweat darkened her shirt. By the time she finished, her hands were blistered despite the protection of her father's gloves, and her anger had crystallized into cold determination. Someone wanted her land badly enough to trespass and survey it illegally. The question was who and how far they were willing to go. Clara was loading the stakes into her saddlebags when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves. A group of wild horses crested the hill at full gallop, their eyes rolling white with panic as they fled some unseen threat. Leading them was a magnificent black stallion, his mane streaming like a battle flag as he drove his herd toward the safety of the ravine. She'd seen these horses before they ran free in the unclaimed territory between her ranch and the Morrison spread. The stallion was a legend in these parts, too wild and proud to be caught, but also too beautiful to be forgotten. Local ranchers had been trying to capture him for years without success. The herd swept past Clara in a river of muscle and motion, but as they neared the ravine, disaster struck. The black stallion, focused on protecting his mares, failed to see the hidden wash that cut across their path. He stumbled at full speed, his legs tangling as he went down hard, rolling twice before coming to rest at the bottom of the gully. Clara didn't think she simply reacted. She spurred Sage toward the ravine, her heart hammering as she watched the stallion struggle to rise. His left front leg buckled under his weight, and she could see the bright flash of bone through torn hide. The other horses milled nervously at the edge of the wash, whinnying their distress, but unable to help their fallen leader. She was halfway down the steep slope when another rider appeared at the top of the ravine. Clara looked up to see the largest man she'd ever encountered easily, 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span half the sky. This had to be Bear, Pete's mysterious newcomer, and the sight of him took what little breath she had left. But there was no time for proper introductions. The stallion was thrashing weakly, his struggles growing more desperate as shock set in. Clara reached the bottom of the wash and approached slowly, talking in the low, soothing tones her father had taught her to use with injured animals. "Easy, boy," she murmured, keeping her hands visible and her movements calm. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're here to help." The stallion's eye fixed on her, wild with pain and fear, but something in her voice seemed to reach him. His struggles ceased, though his flanks heaved with each labored breath. Berit had to be him descended the slope with surprising grace for such a large man. When he spoke, his voice was deep and gentle, like distant thunder on a summer evening. "Legs broken clean through," he said quietly, crouching beside the horse without any wasted motion. "But the bones not shattered. Might be we can save him." Clara looked up at him properly for the first time and felt something shift in her chest. His face was weathered but kind, with laugh lines around eyes the color of storm clouds. There was strength in every line of his features, but also a gentleness that reminded her of her father's hands with a newborn calf. "You know horses," she said. It wasn't a question. "Some." He was already examining the stallion's leg with careful fingers. Worked with an army veterinarian during the war, learned a few things about setting bones. Working together without need for discussion, they fashioned a makeshift splint from branches and strips torn from Clara's spare shirt. Bear held the stallion's head, speaking to the animal in tones so soft Clara had to strain to hear them, while she bound the broken leg as securely as she could manage. The whole process took nearly an hour, but the stallion remained calm under Bear's gentle handling. When they finished, the horse was able to stand, though he favored the injured leg heavily. "He'll need proper care," Bear said, wiping blood from his hands with Clara's water, "somewhere quiet to heal." "I've got space in my barn," Clara heard herself saying, "and I know horses." Something passed between them in that momenta recognition that went deeper than words. Here was a man who understood that some things were worth saving, even when the odds were long, especially then. Together they coaxed the stallion up the gentle slope at the far end of the ravine, taking their time and stopping frequently to let him rest. The other horses followed at a distance, reluctant to abandon their leader, but wary of the humans who'd intervened. "I'm Clara Boone," she said as they walked. "Eli Maddox. Most folks call me Bear." "Why Bear?" He smiled then, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Size, mostly, and I've been told I'm dangerous when cornered." Clara studied his profile as they walked. There was something in his eyes when he'd said that last parter shadow that suggested experience with being cornered and perhaps with being dangerous. But watching him with the injured stallion, she'd seen only patience and care. They reached Clara's barn as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Working together, they made the stallion as comfortable as possible in the largest stall, with fresh hay and clean water within easy reach. "He'll need antibiotics," Bear said, checking the splint one more time, "and someone to watch him through the night." "I'll manage," Clara said. "I've nursed injured animals before." Bear straightened and looked at her directly. "You sure? This isn't like tending a lame cow. Wild horses can be unpredictable, especially when they're hurting." "So can wild women," Clara replied, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded flirtatious, and flirting was a skill she'd never mastered. But Bear's smile returned, warmer this time. "I expect you're right about that." As he prepared to leave, Clara found herself reluctant to see him go. The afternoon had passed too quickly, and she realized she knew almost nothing about this man who'd appeared at exactly the right moment to help save a magnificent animal. "The surveyor's stakes," she said suddenly. "Someone marked my east pasture without permission. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Bear's expression darkened. "What kind of stakes?" Clara described what she'd found and watched his jaw tighten with each detail. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Harlan Creighton," he said finally, "cattle baron from up north. He's been buying up small ranches all through this territory." "Buying or taking?" "Depends how stubborn the owners are." Bear's voice had gone hard. "Be careful, Clara. Men like Creighton don't respect boundaries, property lines, or otherwise." "Are you warning me as a neighbor, or do you know something specific?" Bear met her eyes steadily. "I'm warning you as someone who's seen what happens when good people stand in the way of men who think money makes them untouchable." There was something in his tone that made Clara think he was speaking from personal experience, but before she could ask, he'd tipped his hat and started toward his horse. "Thank you," she called after him, "for helping with the stallion." He paused in the act of mounting and looked back at her. "Thank you for caring enough to try saving him. Not everyone would have bothered." As Bear rode away, Clara stood in her barn doorway watching until he disappeared over the rise. The stallion nickered softly behind her, and she turned to check on her patient. But her mind wasn't on the horse, it was on storm-grey eyes and gentle hands, and the way Bear had looked at her like she was someone worth knowing. The surveyor's stakes lay in a pile beside her barn, a reminder that trouble was coming whether she was ready or not. But for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel quite so alone in facing it. The carved wooden horse sat no bigger than Clara's palm, but the detail work was extraordinary. Eli had whittled each tiny muscle, every flowing line of mane and tail, with the kind of patience that spoke of long evenings and gentle hands. Clara discovered it 3 days after the stallion rescue, placed carefully on her fence post, like a small offering. She was checking the black stallion's splint when young Tommy Morrison came running up to her barn, his freckled face bright with excitement. The boy was Pete's great-nephew, all of 8 years old and horse-crazy in the way only children could be. Miss Clara, is it true you got the black devil in your barn?" "His name is Shadow," Clara said, having decided the stallion needed something better than the black devil or that wild horse. "And yes, he's here, but he's healing, so we need to be very quiet." Tommy's eyes went wide as he peered through the stall bars at the magnificent animal. Shadow lifted his head at the boy's approach, but didn't seem alarmed, perhaps, because children carried no threat in their scent. "Uncle Pete says Bear helped you save him," Tommy whispered. "Says Bear's got magic hands with horses." "Your Uncle Pete talks too much," Clara said, but she was smiling. "And there's nothing magic about knowing how to set a bone properly." "Bear made me this," Tommy said proudly, pulling the wooden horse from his pocket. "Says every cowboy needs his own horse, even if it's just a little one." Clara took the carving, marveling at the craftsmanship. She could see the care that had gone into every detail, the way the artist had captured not just the form, but the spirit of a horse in motion. This wasn't the work of idle hands. This was someone who understood beauty and took time to create it. "It's beautiful, Tommy. When did Bear give this to you?" "Yesterday, when Mama and me went to town. He was sitting outside Miller's store, and I was telling him about wanting a horse of my own someday. He just pulled out his knife and started carving, right there on the spot. Didn't say much, but when he finished, he handed it over like it was nothing special." But it was special, Clara thought. Any man who would spend his time creating something beautiful for a child was special indeed. Over the following days, Eli began stopping by to check on Shadow's progress. At first, his visits were brief and businesslike, examining the splint, checking for signs of infection, making sure the wild horse was adapting to captivity. But gradually, the visits grew longer. Clara found herself looking forward to the sound of his horse's hooves on the packed earth of her yard. She began timing her evening chores to coincide with his arrival, and if that meant she sometimes repeated work she'd already finished, well, nobody needed to know that. They developed an easy rhythm of working together. Eli would check Shadow, while Clara prepared the evening feed, and then they'd sit on her porch steps, sharing coffee from her father's old tin pot. The conversation started with horses and cattle, weather and work, but slowly deepened into something more personal. "You grow up on this land?" Eli asked one evening, his long legs stretched out before him as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. "Born in that house," Clara said, nodding toward the modest structure behind them. "My grandmother delivered me herself when the doctor couldn't make it through a spring storm. Must be nice having that kind of roots." There was something wistful in his voice that made Clara study his profile. "What about you? Where's home?" Eli was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Haven't had what you'd call a permanent home in quite some time. Work takes me different places." "What kind of work?" Again, that hesitation. "Cattle mostly, sometimes other things." Clara sensed there were layers to his story that he wasn't ready to share, and she respected that. Everyone had a right to their privacy, especially someone who seemed as genuinely kind as Eli proved to be day after day. She learned other things about him through observation. He never raised his voice, even when dealing with the most stubborn animals. His clothes were well made but worn, suggesting someone who took care of his possessions but had owned them for years. His hands, despite their size and obvious strength, were remarkably gentle. She'd watched him handle a bird with a broken wing, with the same care most people reserved for fine china. "You ever think about settling down?" Clara asked one evening, immediately regretting the forward question. Eli glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Used to think I might, someday, but a man in my position has to be careful about putting down roots." "What position is that?" "The kind where trouble has a way of following you around." Clara wanted to ask what kind of trouble, but something in his tone warned her off. Instead, she poured more coffee from the shared tin and let the comfortable silence settle between them. It was during these quiet evenings that Clara began to notice changes in herself. She found herself taking more care with her appearance, braiding her hair instead of just tying it back, and washing her face before Eli arrived. She began wearing her mother's old blue shirt, the one that brought out the color of her eyes, instead of her usual work-stained garments. The realization that she was primping for a man both thrilled and terrified her. Clara had never been the type to fuss over her appearance, had never seen the point when her daily work would undo any efforts within hours. But Eli made her want to try, made her wonder what she might look like through his eyes. One morning, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window and was startled by what she saw. The woman looking back at her had a softness around the eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of hopeful warmth that transformed her entire face. Was this what happiness looked like? This gentle anticipation that made even ordinary tasks feel lighter? But with the hope came fear. Clara had built her life around self-reliance and emotional protection. The thought of caring for someone, truly caring in a way that made her vulnerable, was both exhilarating and terrifying. She was wrestling with these thoughts when Sarah Mitchell appeared in her yard one afternoon, riding side saddle on a pretty bay mare and looking like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Sarah's dress was a soft yellow that complemented her golden hair, and her skin looked porcelain smooth despite the afternoon sun. "Clara, I hope you don't mind my stopping by unannounced," Sarah called out, her voice musical with practiced charm. "Of course not," Clara replied, wiping her hands on her work pants and feeling suddenly conscious of her rough appearance. "What brings you out this way?" "Oh, I was just riding and thought I'd check on you. All alone out here, it must get so lonely." Sarah's blue eyes swept the ranch with what might have been sympathy or calculation. "I heard you've been entertaining visitors lately." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "If you mean Eli Maddox, he's been helping with an injured horse, nothing more than neighborly assistance." "Of course," Sarah said, but her smile had a sharp edge. "Though I have to say, he's certainly caught the attention of every unmarried woman in town. Such a fascinating man, so mysterious and strong. I imagine any woman would be flattered by his attention." The implication was clear. Any woman might be flattered, but a man like Eli would naturally choose someone like Sarah over someone like Clara. The words hit their mark, and Clara felt her protective walls beginning to rebuild themselves. "I'm sure he'll find his way to the right woman eventually," Clara said carefully. "Oh, I'm certain he will." Sarah replied with supreme confidence. "Well, I should be getting back. Do take care of yourself, Clara, and do let me know if you need anything at all." After Sarah rode away, Clara stood in her yard feeling like she'd been subtly but thoroughly put in her place. Sarah was everything. Clara was note-refined, beautiful, socially accomplished. What had made Clara think, even for a moment, that a man like Eli would choose a sun-weathered ranchwoman over someone who embodied everything society said men should want? That evening, when Eli arrived for his usual visit, Clara found herself distant and guarded. She checked Shadow's leg with brisk efficiency and declined his offer to share coffee on the porch. "Everything all right?" Eli asked, his grey eyes concerned. "Fine," Clara said, not meeting his gaze. "Just tired. Long day." But she could feel him studying her, and when he finally left, she had the uncomfortable feeling that he'd seen right through her sudden coolness to the hurt underneath. As she watched him ride away, Clara wondered if she was protecting herself or simply proving Sarah right, that she wasn't the kind of woman who could hold a man like Eli Maddox's interest for long. The shared coffee tin had seen better days, its blue enamel chipped in places, the bottom slightly dented from years of use around campfires and kitchen tables. But every morning for the past 2 weeks, Clara and Eli had passed it between them like a ritual, sharing the strong black brew that fueled their early chores. Clara treasured those quiet moments before the day's work began in earnest. There was something intimate about sharing coffee from the same vessel, about the way Eli's large hands dwarfed the tin cup, about how he always made sure to leave her the last swallow. It felt domestic in a way that both comforted and unsettled her. This morning, however, the tin sat unused on her kitchen shelf. Clara had been distant for 3 days now, ever since Sarah Mitchell's visit, and she could see the confusion in Eli's eyes, even as he respected her withdrawal. "Shadow's doing well," Eli said, running his hand along the stallion's neck. The horse's leg had healed remarkably, and he was beginning to put weight on it again. "Another week or two, and he might be ready to rejoin his herd." "That's good," Clara replied, focusing on measuring oats instead of looking at Eli. "Wild things belong free." "Most do," Eli agreed quietly, "but sometimes they find something worth staying for." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Clara wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. She busied herself checking water troughs and avoided his gaze. It was later that morning, while Clara was mending fence in her south pasture, that trouble arrived in the form of 3 riders. She recognized the leader immediately, Buck Henley, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his loyalty to whoever paid him best. The 2 men flanking him were cut from the same cloth, hard-faced drifters who wore their guns like other men wore hats. Clara straightened slowly, her hand moving instinctively toward the rifle she kept strapped to her saddle. Sage sensed the tension and shifted nervously beneath her. "Morning, Miss Boone," Buck called out, his voice carrying false courtesy. "Beautiful day for a ride." "My land's not open for riding," Clara replied evenly. "You're trespassing." Buck's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Now, that's where you might be wrong. See, there's some question about exactly where your property lines run. Thought we'd take a look around, make sure everything's proper and legal." "I know exactly where my boundaries are," Clara said, "and you're on the wrong side of them." One of Buck's companions, a lean man with pale eyes, spoke up. "Seems to me a woman alone might want to be more accommodating to her neighbors, especially when those neighbors are trying to help her understand her situation." The threat was barely veiled, and Clara felt her temper rising. "My situation is just fine, thank you, and I'm asking you nicely to leave." "And if we don't feel like leaving just yet?" Buck asked, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Before Clara could respond, the thunder of approaching hooves announced another rider. Eli appeared over the rise, and Clara had never been so glad to see anyone in her life. But her relief turned to concern when she saw the change that came over him as he took in the scene. The gentle giant who carved toys for children and spoke softly to injured horses was gone. In his place sat a man who radiated danger like heat from a forge. His grey eyes had gone cold as winter stone, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made smart men think twice. "Problem here?" Eli asked, positioning his horse between Clara and the 3 men. Buck's confident demeanor flickered slightly. "No problem at all. Just having a friendly conversation with Miss Boone about property lines." "Conversation's over," Eli said simply. "Says who?" the pale-eyed man demanded. Eli's smile was nothing like the warm expressions Clara had grown accustomed to. This smile promised consequences. "Says me." Something passed between the meaner communication that operated below the level of words. Buck studied Eli with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey, and apparently decided the odds weren't in his favor. "Well, we've seen what we came to see," Buck said, gathering his reins. "Miss Boone, you think real careful about what we discussed. Sometimes being stubborn costs more than a person can afford." The 3 men rode away, but not before the pale-eyed one shot Clara, a look that made her skin crawl. When they were gone, Clara realized she'd been holding her breath. "You all right?" Eli asked, his voice gentle again, but his eyes still scanning the horizon. "I'm fine," Clara said, though her hands were shaking slightly. "Who were they?" "Trouble," Eli replied grimly. "Buck Henley and his boys work for Harlan Creighton. They're not the kind of men who make social calls." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What did they want?" "Your land, and they wanted you to know they're serious about getting it." "But I'm not selling. I'll never sell." Eli's expression was troubled. "Men like Creighton don't always wait for willing sellers, Clara. You need to be careful." "Are you trying to scare me?" "I'm trying to keep you alive," Eli said bluntly. "These aren't the kind of men who give up easy." Clara felt a surge of the old anger, the defensive pride that had sustained her through years of being overlooked and underestimated. I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for years. Against drifters and small-time troublemakers, maybe. But this is different. How would you know? The words came out sharper than Clara intended, fueled by fear and frustration. You've been here all of 2 weeks. What makes you such an expert on my problems? Eli was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice was careful, because I've seen what men like Creighton do to people who stand in their way. And I've seen what happens to good people who try to fight that kind of power alone. There was something in his tone, a weight of experience, that suggested he wasn't speaking hypothetically. Clara wanted to ask what he'd seen, where he'd seen it, but the walls she'd rebuilt after Sarah's visit held firm. I appreciate your concern, she said stiffly, but I can handle this. Clara, I said I can handle it. Eli studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. All right. But if you change your mind, if you need help with anything, you know where to find me. He rode away without another word, leaving Clara alone in her pasture with the taste of regret bitter in her mouth. She'd pushed him away again, and this time she wasn't even sure why. Fear, maybe, or pride, or the terrible suspicion that a man like Eli was too good to be real, and if she let herself care too much, the inevitable disappointment would break something in her that might never heal. That evening, Clara sat on her porch steps alone, the coffee tin cold and unused beside her. Shadow nickered from his stall, perhaps sensing her mood. The stallion had grown calmer during his time in captivity, but she could see the wildness still burning in his eyes, the need to run free across open country. Maybe that was Eli's nature too. Maybe she was foolish to think a man like him would stay in a place like Coyote Bend with a woman like her. Better to keep her distance now than to suffer the pain of watching him leave later. But as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Clara couldn't shake the memory of how Eli had positioned himself between her and danger without hesitation, or the way his voice had gone deadly serious when he'd told Buck Henley the conversation was over. For the first time in her adult life, someone had stepped forward to protect her. The question was whether she was brave enough to let him. The coffee tin caught the last rays of sunlight, its scratched surface reflecting the sky like a small, imperfect mirror. Tomorrow, Clara promised herself, she would swallow her pride and her fear. Tomorrow, she would share coffee with Eli again, and try to find the words to explain the walls she kept building between them. But tonight, she sat alone on her porch, watching the darkness gather and wondering if some chances, once lost, ever came around again. Clara's mother's wedding ring lay wrapped in faded blue silk at the bottom of her dresser drawer, hidden beneath letters she'd never sent and photographs too painful to display. The simple gold band caught the lamplight as Clara lifted it with trembling fingers, remembering the stories her father had told about the day he'd placed it on Catherine Boone's hand. She was the prettiest girl in 3 counties, Thomas had always said, his eyes growing soft with memory. Could have had her pick of any man, but she chose me, never did figure out why. Clara had heard the story dozens of times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, as she held the ring up to the light, she found herself wondering what it would feel like to be chosen, truly chosen by someone whose love came without conditions or reservations. The ring had been her grandmother's originally, passed down through 3 generations of Boone women who'd known both the joy and sorrow that came with loving deeply. Clara's mother had worn it for only 12 years before the fever took her, leaving behind a husband who never quite recovered and a daughter who'd learned early that love was a luxury that could be snatched away without warning. Clara slipped the ring onto her finger, surprised to find it fit perfectly. She'd grown into her mother's hands without realizing it, the same long fingers, the same calloused palms from years of ranch work. But where Catherine Boone had been delicate and refined, Clara was sturdy and practical. Where her mother had been the kind of woman men wrote poetry about, Clara was the kind they barely noticed. A soft knock at her kitchen door interrupted her brooding. Clara quickly removed the ring and tucked it back into its silk wrapper before answering. She found Eli standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen before. "I hope it's not too late," he said. "I wanted to apologize for this morning, for pushing when you asked me to back off." Clara felt her chest tighten. In her experience, men didn't apologize, they doubled down or disappeared entirely. The fact that Eli had come to make amends only made her defensive walls feel more fragile. "You don't need to apologize," she said, stepping back to let him enter. "You were trying to help." "But I overstepped," Eli insisted, following her into the kitchen. "You've been managing this ranch just fine without my advice." "Have I?" Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because from where I'm standing, it feels like everything's falling apart. The fence in the south pasture needs replacing, the well pumps acting up again, and now I've got cattle barons sending their hired guns to threaten me. You're not alone in this, Clara." The words hung between them, laden with promise and possibility. Clara wanted desperately to believe them, but a lifetime of disappointment had taught her to be cautious with hope. "Aren't I?" she asked quietly. "Because it seems to me that everyone leaves eventually. Death, duty, or just plain boredom, there's always a reason." Eli moved closer, his grey eyes intent on her face. "Is that what you think, that I'm going to leave?" "I think," Clara said carefully, "that you're a good man who's been kind to me when you didn't have to be, and I think good men like you don't usually stick around places like this for very long." "What if I wanted to stick around?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She turned away, busying herself with straightening items that didn't need straightening, afraid to let him see how much his words affected her. "People want lots of things," she said. "Doesn't mean they're practical or possible." "Clara." Eli's voice was soft but insistent. "Look at me." She turned reluctantly and found him standing much closer than she'd expected. Close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his grey eyes, close enough to catch the scent of leather and soap that seemed to follow him everywhere. "What if I told you I've been thinking about staying in Coyote Bend?" he said. "What if I said I'd found something here worth fighting for?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'd say you haven't been here long enough to know what you're talking about. How long does it take to recognize something real?" The question hung in the air between them, and Clara felt the last of her defenses beginning to crumble. She wanted to step closer, wanted to reach out and touch his face, wanted to believe that someone could see past her rough exterior to whatever lay beneath. Instead, she stepped back. "Real doesn't matter if it's not practical," she said. "I'm not the kind of woman men like you choose, Eli. I'm the kind they're grateful to have around when they need help. But when it comes time to settle down, they want someone softer, someone who knows how to be a proper wife." "And what makes you think you wouldn't make a proper wife?" Clara gestured helplessly at herself, the work-stained clothes, the calloused hands, the hair that had escaped its braid hours ago. "Look at me. I can birth a calf and repair a windmill, but I burn more biscuits than I bake successfully. I've never worn a dress that wasn't handed down from someone else, and I don't know the first thing about running a household that doesn't revolve around cattle and horses." "Clara, and even if none of that mattered," she continued, the words pouring out like water from a broken dam, "you don't know me. Not really. You don't know that I talk to my horses when I'm lonely, or that I still sleep with one of my mother's quilts because it smells like lavender and safety. You don't know that I'm terrified of thunderstorms, or that sometimes I catch myself wishing for things I know I can't have." Eli listened to her confession without interruption, his expression growing more tender with each revelation. When she finally fell silent, he reached out slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You're wrong about something," he said gently. "What's that?" "I do know you. Maybe not all the details yet, but I know the important things. I know you'd risk your own safety to save an injured animal. I know you work harder than any 3 men and never complain about it. I know you're loyal to your friends and generous with your help, even when people don't deserve it." His thumb traced along her cheekbone, and Clara felt her knees go weak. "I know you're stronger than you think and braver than you give yourself credit for," Eli continued. "And I know that any man who'd choose flash over substance, beauty over character, Doesn't deserve a woman like you anyway." Clara's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "You don't understand. Women like Sarah Mitchell don't have half your courage or a tenth of your heart," Eli finished firmly. Before Clara could argue further, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, asking permission rather than demanding surrender. But when Clara's hands fisted in his shirt and she kissed him back, Eli deepened the connection, pouring weeks of growing affection and desire into the moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Clara stared up at Eli in wonder, her lips tingling from the contact. "That," she whispered, "was my first real kiss." Eli's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with something that looked like reverence. "Then I'm honored to be the one to give it to you." The moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard, multiple riders approaching fast. Eli's demeanor changed instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip as he positioned himself between Clara and the door. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Through the kitchen window, Clara could see torches flickering in the darkness. 5 men sat their horses in her yard, their faces hidden in shadow, but their intentions clear from their aggressive posture. "Clara Boone," Buck Henley's voice carried through the night air. "Time for another conversation." "Don't answer," Eli murmured, but Clara was already moving toward the door. "This is my land," she said firmly. "I won't hide in my own house." She stepped onto the porch with Eli close behind her and felt a small measure of satisfaction when she saw Buck's eyes narrow at the sight of her companion. "Evening, Miss Boone," Buck called out with false courtesy. "Seems you've got yourself a guardian angel." "I've got myself a friend," Clara replied evenly. "Now state your business or get off my property." "Business is simple," Buck said. "Mr. Creighton's prepared to make you a generous offer for your ranch. More than generous, considering the troubles you might face if you decide to be stubborn." "I'm not selling." "That's a shame," Buck said, shaking his head in mock sadness, "because accidents have a way of happening to folks who don't know when to be reasonable. Fences get cut, wells get poisoned, sometimes buildings catch fire in the middle of the night." Eli's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "That sounds like a threat. Just explaining how the world works to folks who might not understand." Buck replied, "Course, a man in your position might want to think twice before getting involved in other people's business." "What position is that?" Eli asked, his tone deceptively casual. Buck's smile was all teeth. "The position of someone who's got his own troubles to worry about. Word travels fast in these parts, and some words travel faster than others." Clara felt Eli tense beside her, and she knew with sudden certainty that Buck was talking about something specific, something from Eli's past that she didn't understand. "My troubles are my own," Eli said quietly. "But anyone who threatens Clara is taking on new troubles they might not be ready for." The 2 men stared at each other across the yard, and Clara could feel the weight of unspoken history between them. Whatever secrets Eli was carrying, Buck Henley knew at least some of them. "Well," Buck said finally, "I reckon we've said our piece. Miss Boone, you think real hard about Mr. Creighton's offer, and you think about what kind of friends you want to keep. Some associations can be more dangerous than others." The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara and Eli alone on the porch. But the night no longer felt peaceful, it felt full of watching eyes and hidden dangers. "What did he mean?" Clara asked quietly. "About your position, about troubles." Eli was silent for a long moment, staring out into the darkness where the riders had vanished. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "There are things in my past, Clara, things I can't change and can't outrun forever. Buck knows some of those things, and he'll use them if he thinks it serves his purpose." "What kind of things?" Eli turned to face her, and in the lamplight spilling from her kitchen window, she could see the pain in his eyes. "The kind that might make you think twice about wanting me to stick around," he said quietly. Clara reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told stories she didn't yet know. "Try me," she said simply. But even as she spoke the words, Clara could feel the weight of secrets settling between them like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The kiss they'd shared, the promises hanging unspoken in the air, all of it, felt suddenly fragile in the face of whatever truth Eli was carrying. Still, she didn't let go of his hand. Whatever was coming, whatever Buck Henley knew or thought he knew, Clara had made her choice. She was tired of being afraid, tired of protecting herself from hurt by refusing to care. If loving Eli meant facing danger, then she'd face it. If it meant learning truths that might change everything, then she'd learn them. But she wouldn't let fear make her decisions anymore. The branding iron had been forged by Clara's grandfather over 50 years ago, its iron handle wrapped in leather, worn smooth by 3 generations of Boone hands. The brand itself was simple but distinctive, a curved B, embracing a small star, representing the family name and their hope that their legacy would shine long after they were gone. Clara held the iron now, feeling its familiar weight as she prepared for the spring branding. The work was hard and dirty, requiring strength and skill that most people assumed women didn't possess. But Clara had been working cattle since she could barely reach a horse's stirrup, and she could wield the iron as surely as any man in the territory. What made this morning different was Eli's presence at her side. He'd arrived before dawn with his own horse saddled and ready, offering his help without being asked. The easy partnership they'd developed over the past weeks had deepened into something more complex since their kiss 3 nights ago, something that felt both natural and charged with possibility. "Your grandfather did good work," Eli said, examining the brand with professional appreciation. "Clean design, easy to read. Some of these fancy outfits use brands so complicated you need a magnifying glass to make sense of them. Grandpa always said a brand should tell your story in the simplest way possible," Clara replied, testing the iron's heat. "The B for Boone, the star for hope, everything our family believed in, right there in the metal." They worked side by side as the sun climbed higher, moving through Clara's small herd with practiced efficiency. Eli proved to be every bit as skilled as she'd expected, his movements economical and sure, his touch gentle enough not to spook the cattle, but firm enough to get the job done. Between the physical work and the easy conversation, Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. This felt right, working alongside someone who understood the rhythm of ranch life, who didn't need constant instruction or encouragement. Someone who made the hard work feel less like burden and more like partnership. "I could get used to this," Eli said during a break, wiping sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve. "The work?" Clara asked, though something in his tone suggested he meant more than just the branding. "The company," he replied, meeting her eyes directly. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the moment. She looked up to see a familiar figure cresting the hill, Sarah Mitchell, but this time she wasn't alone. Riding beside her was a man Clara didn't recognize, tall and well-dressed, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of money and education. "Clara," Sarah called out as they approached. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." "Just branding," Clara replied evenly, suddenly conscious of her sweat-stained shirt and the dust coating her clothes. Sarah, as usual, looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine despite being on horseback. "How perfectly rustic," Sarah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Clara, I'd like you to meet James Wellington. He's visiting from back east, and I've been showing him around our charming little territory." James Wellington dismounted with the fluid grace of someone born to wealth and privilege. He was handsome, in a refined way, clean-shaven, soft-handed, with intelligent brown eyes and an easy smile. "Miss Boone," he said, removing his hat with a flourish. "Sarah's told me so much about you. It's remarkable, meeting a woman who runs her own ranch operation." "There's nothing remarkable about honest work," Clara replied, accepting his handshake despite her dirty palms. "Of course not," James agreed smoothly, "though I must say, it's unusual to see a lady handling such physical labor. Back in Boston, we tend to believe women are too delicate for this kind of work." Clara felt Eli tense beside her, though he remained silent. There was something in James's tone, no quite condescending, but close enough to make her bristles rise. "Women out here tend to be more practical than delicate," Clara said carefully. Oh, but surely you dream of something more refined, James pressed. A woman of your obvious intelligence and capability could do so much more in a proper social setting, with the right guidance, of course. James is being modest, Sarah interjected with another one of her sharp smiles. He's quite successful in business back east. Railroad investments, I believe, and he's unattached. She let that last word hang in the air like an invitation. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from interest, but from the transparent attempt at matchmaking. Did Sarah really think Clara would be so grateful for male attention that she'd swoon over the first eligible man to show interest? That's nice, Clara said neutrally, then turned to include Eli in the conversation. James, I'd like you to meet Eli Maddox. He's been helping with my injured stallion. James glanced at Eli with the kind of dismissive assessment wealthy men reserved for hired help. Pleasure, he said without offering his hand. Eli nodded acknowledgement, but didn't speak. Clara could see the careful control in his posture, the way he'd withdrawn slightly, without actually stepping back. She realized with a flash of insight that Eli was protecting her, letting her handle the situation, while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. Well, Sarah said brightly, we really should let you get back to your work. But James, didn't you have something you wanted to discuss with Clara? James smiled, revealing perfect white teeth. Actually, yes, Sarah mentioned you might be interested in selling your ranch. I'm always looking for investment opportunities in growing territories. I'm not selling, Clara said firmly. Of course, James said with the patient tone of someone accustomed to overcoming objections. But surely you've considered what you might do with the capital. A woman of your intelligence could do remarkable things with the right backing. Perhaps something more suitable to your genre, a boarding house in town, or a dress shop. Clara felt her temper rising. This ranch is perfectly suitable to my gender, thank you. It's been in my family for 3 generations. But at what cost? James pressed gently. Look at your hands, my dear. Look at the toll this rough life is taking on you. Wouldn't you prefer something easier? Something that would allow you to develop your more feminine qualities? The words hit every insecurity Clara had ever carried about her appearance and her place in the world. She was suddenly, painfully aware of her calloused palms, her sun-weathered skin, her unfashionable clothes. Next to Sarah's porcelain perfection, she felt like exactly what James was implying, a rough, unfeminine creature who'd forgotten how to be a proper woman. But before Clara could respond, Eli stepped forward. His voice was quiet but carried an edge that made James's smile falter. Miss Boone's hands tell the story of honest work and genuine accomplishment, Eli said. Any man worth his salt would see them as beautiful. James's eyebrows rose in surprise at being contradicted by someone he'd clearly dismissed as unimportant. I'm sure you mean well, but... I mean exactly what I said, Eli interrupted, his grey eyes fixed on James with an intensity that made the other man step back slightly. Clara Boone is the finest woman in this territory, and any suggestions otherwise show more about the speaker's limitations than hers. The silence that followed was charged with tension. Sarah's mouth had fallen open slightly, clearly not having expected this turn of events. James looked between Eli and Clara with dawning understanding, his expression shifting from condescension to something sharper. I see, James said slowly. Well, it appears my assessment of the situation was incomplete. Clara felt a rush of gratitude and something deeper, fierce joy at hearing Eli defend her so publicly and completely. But underneath the gratitude was a growing awareness that this moment had changed something fundamental between all of them. Perhaps we should be going, Sarah said quickly, her cheeks flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger. James, I'm sure Clara is very busy. As the 2 visitors prepared to leave, James turned back to Clara with a smile that no longer looked quite so friendly. Miss Boone, if you change your mind about selling, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'll be in the area for several more weeks, and my offer will remain open. After they rode away, Clara and Eli stood in silence for a moment. The easy companionship of the morning felt strained, replaced by an awareness of how much had been revealed in those few charged minutes. Thank you, Clara said finally. For what you said, I meant every word, Eli replied. But I may have made things more complicated for you. Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw not the rough cowboy others might dismiss, but a man who'd stood up for her when it mattered, a man who saw her worth when others questioned it. Eli, she said quietly, I don't want different women. I want you. The words echoed his future confession, spoken now in reverse, a promise given instead of received. Eli's eyes widened at her boldness, then softened with an expression so tender it took her breath away. Clara, I mean it, she said, stepping closer to him. Whatever complications come, whatever your past holds, whatever trouble follows you, I want you. All of you. Eli reached for her then, pulling her against his chest and holding her tight. Clara could feel his heart pounding against her ear, could feel the slight tremor in his hands as they tangled in her hair. You don't know what you're saying, he murmured. You don't know what it might cost you. Then tell me, Clara said, pulling back to look into his eyes. Trust me enough to tell me the truth. For a moment, she thought he might. She could see the war playing out in his expression, the desire to confess warring with the need to protect her from whatever knowledge he carried. But in the end, fear won. Eli stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. I can't, he said simply. Not yet. Clara felt the rejection like a physical blow, but she forced herself to nod understanding. If Eli needed time, she could give him that. If he needed patience, she had reserves of that too. But as they returned to their work, the branding iron heavy in Clara's hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whatever secrets Eli carried, whatever forces were aligning against them, she could feel change coming like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The brand that marked her cattle told the story of hope and heritage, of a family that had built something lasting in an uncertain world. Now Clara found herself hoping that the story wouldn't end with her, that somehow, despite all the complications and secrets and threats, she and Eli could build something together that would last. But hope, she was learning, was a fragile thing. And in the territory where Harlan Creighton's influence was growing stronger by the day, even the strongest hopes needed more than good intentions to survive. The sheriff's badge lay tarnished and forgotten at the bottom of Eli's saddlebags, wrapped in an oilcloth that had kept it hidden for 2 long years. Clara discovered it by accident while helping him tend to his horse's thrown shoe, her fingers brushing against the wrapped bundle as she reached for his tools. "What's this?" she asked, lifting the package before Eli could stop her. For a moment, he considered lying, telling her it was just old gear, nothing important. But the look in her eyes, the trust she'd shown him, despite his secrecy, made deception impossible. "Something from my past," Eli said quietly. "Something I should have told you about before now." Clara's fingers worked at the oilcloth wrapping, and when the badge emerged into the lamplight of the barn, her breath caught. The star was real silver, etched with the words Sheriff and Territory of Wyoming in careful script. It was the badge of a man who'd sworn to uphold justice, to protect the innocent, to stand between good people and the darkness that sometimes swallowed them whole. "You were a lawman," Clara said. "It wasn't a question." "For 8 years," Eli confirmed, his voice heavy with memory. "Started as a deputy in Cheyenne, worked my way up, thought I was making a difference." Clara turned the badge over in her hands, noting the small dent in one corner, the scratches that spoke of hard use. "What happened? Why did you stop?" Eli sank onto a hay bale, suddenly looking older than his years. "Because I learned that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, and sometimes the people sworn to uphold one will destroy the other to protect their own interests." The story came out slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from an infected wound. Eli told her about the corruption he'd discovered judges bought and paid for, evidence disappearing from lockups, criminals walking free while honest citizens suffered. He told her about the night he'd finally gathered enough proof to expose the conspiracy, only to have his own sheriff turn on him. "Sheriff Marcus Webb," Eli said, the name bitter on his tongue. 20-year veteran, respected by everyone in the territory. Also taking money from cattle barons and mine owners to look the other way when their men got violent with homesteaders and small ranchers. Like Harlan Creighton, Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Webb was in Creighton's pocket from the beginning. Every time someone complained about intimidation tactics or land grabbing, the complaints mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories or left town suddenly. Evidence vanished. Clara's hands tightened on the badge. But you found proof. I thought I did. Spent months gathering documentation, getting statements from victims, tracking financial records. I had enough evidence to bring down the whole network. Eli's laugh was bitter, but when I tried to present it to the territorial governor, I discovered just how deep the corruption went. They were all involved? Not all, but enough. The governor was clean, but his aid was bought. My evidence never made it to the right hands. Instead, it went straight back to Webb and his conspirators. Eli stood and began pacing the small space of the barn, as if movement could help him escape the memories. They tried to kill me that night. Would have succeeded, if not for pure luck. I happened to be out of my hotel room when they came calling. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. So you ran? I ran, Eli confirmed. Because dead men can't testify, and I was the only one left who knew the whole truth. Webb put out word that I'd gone rogue, that I was the corrupt one. Made it look like I'd stolen evidence and fled with payoff money. But you could have fought back, cleared your name. With what? They had the evidence I'd gathered, could spin it any way they wanted, and they had the backing of every corrupt official in the territory. A fugitive sheriff's word against the establishment? Eli shook his head. I'd have been dead within a week. Clara stared at the badge in her hands, understanding flooding through her. That's why Buck Henley knew things about your past. Because Creighton is part of the same network. Creighton was one of Webb's biggest contributors. When Buck mentioned my troubles, he was letting me know they'd figured out who I really am. Eli's expression darkened. Which means my time here is running out. No. The word came out fiercer than Clara intended. You're not running again. Clara. No, she repeated, standing to face him. You said you'd found something worth fighting for. Did you mean it? Eli's grey eyes searched her face. You know I did. Then fight. Here, now, with me. You don't understand what you're asking. These people don't just threaten, they kill. They destroy anyone who stands in their way. Clara stepped closer, close enough to see the pain and fear warring in his expression. Then we stop them. Together. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Clara held up the badge, letting it catch the lamplight. You were a sheriff, Eli. You swore an oath to protect people like me from men like Creighton. Maybe the law failed you before, but it doesn't have to fail again. I'm not a sheriff anymore. Haven't been for 2 years. Says who? Some corrupt officials who were more interested in protecting their profits than serving justice. Clara's voice grew stronger, more certain. That badge doesn't represent them, Eli. It represents the oath you took, the man you chose to be. They can't take that away from you. Eli stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Even if that were true, even if I could somehow reclaim my authority, it would put you in more danger than you can imagine. I'm already in danger. Clara pointed out. Creighton wants my land, and he's not going to stop trying to take it. At least this way, I'd be fighting back instead of just defending. You could leave, Eli said desperately. Sell to Creighton, take the money, start over somewhere, safe. Clara's laugh was sharp. And go where? Become what? A city woman who serves tea and discusses the weather. This is my home, Eli. This is who I am. I won't let them drive me away, and I won't let them drive you away either. She pressed the badge into his hands, her fingers covering his. Besides, I just figured out why you really came to Coyote Bend. Eli's eyebrows rose. What do you mean? Think about it. Of all the places you could have ended up, all the ranches that might have hired you, you came here. To the one place where Creighton was making his move, where his corruption was about to claim another victim. Clara's eyes gleamed with understanding. You weren't running from your past, Eli. You were circling back to finish it. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. Eli had told himself he'd come to Coyote Bend by chance, that he'd simply been drifting, and this seemed like as good a place as any to lay low. But now, looking at Clara's earnest face, he realized she was right. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, he'd known exactly what he was doing. He'd known Creighton was operating in this territory, known there would be victims who needed protecting. He'd told himself he was done being a lawman, but the truth was simpler and more complex. He'd never stopped being one. "Even if you're right," Eli said slowly, "even if I came here to make a stand, I can't ask you to risk everything for my fight. It's not just your fight anymore." Clara replied firmly, "The moment Creighton set his sights on my land, it became my fight too. The moment you decided to help me, it became our fight." She reached up and cupped his face in her work-roughened hands. "I love you, Eli Maddox. I love the man who carves toys for children and speaks gently to injured horses. I love the man who stepped between me and danger without hesitation, and I love the sheriff who risked everything to stand up for what's right." Eli's control finally cracked. He pulled Clara against him, burying his face in her hair as 2 years of loneliness and fear poured out of him. "I love you too," he whispered. "God help me. I love you too." They held each other in the lamplight of the barn, surrounded by the familiar scents of hay and horses, while outside the wind carried whispers of the storm that was coming. But for the first time since he'd fled Wyoming 2 years ago, Eli felt something other than despair. He felt hope. Clara was right. The badge in his hands didn't represent the corrupt officials who'd betrayed their oaths. It represented the promise he'd made to protect the innocent, to stand against injustice, to be the barrier between good people and those who would prey upon them. Maybe it was time to pin it on again. "If we do this," Eli said, pulling back to look into Clara's eyes, "if we really make this stand, there's no going back. Creighton and his people will come with everything they have. Then we'll be ready for them," Clara replied with quiet determination. "You understand what this means? I'll have to send word to the territorial governor, try to get my authority reinstated. There'll be investigations, trials, probably violence before it's all over. I understand. And if something goes wrong, if they succeed in killing me..." Clara silenced him with a fierce kiss. When they broke apart, her eyes were blazing with determination. "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said firmly, "because you're not facing this alone anymore. You've got me. You've got Pete Morrison and the other honest ranchers in the territory. You've got people who believe in justice and are willing to fight for it." Eli looked down at the badge again, feeling its weight not as a burden but as a responsibility he was finally ready to shoulder again. "Sheriff Eli Maddox," he said, testing the words. "It has a nice ring to it." Clara smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "It suits you better than Bear." "What made you so sure?" Eli asked. "About why I came here, about what I really wanted." "Because I know you," Clara said simply, "and because good men don't stop being good just because evil men try to destroy them. They find another way to fight." Outside the barn, Shadow whinnied softly, as if sensing the change in the air. The stallion had healed enough to return to the wild, but like Eli, he'd found something worth staying for. As Clara and Eli stood together, planning their next move, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows beyond the barn. Buck Henley had come to deliver another message from his boss, but what he'd overheard was far more valuable than any threat. By morning, Harlan Creighton would know that the fugitive sheriff he'd helped drive from Wyoming was not only alive but preparing to pin on his badge again. The war for Coyote Bend was about to begin in earnest. But that night, in the quiet safety of Clara's barn, 2 people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances made their plans and pledged their trust to each other. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Clara's father's rifle had killed its share of predators over the years, wolves that threatened the cattle, rattlesnakes that menaced the horses, and once, a mountain lion that had gotten too comfortable around the ranch buildings. But it had never been aimed at another human being, and Clara prayed as she cleaned and loaded it that tomorrow wouldn't change that. The weapon was a Winchester repeater, reliable and accurate in steady hands. Thomas Boone had taught his daughter to shoot before she could properly saddle a horse, and Clara could put 3 shots in a silver dollar at 100 yards. But shooting at targets and shooting at men were entirely different propositions, and she wondered if she'd have the resolve when the moment came. "Second thoughts?" Eli asked, watching her check the rifle's action for the 3rd time. "Third and fourth thoughts," Clara admitted, "but not about fighting, about whether I'm strong enough to do what might be necessary." Eli moved to sit beside her on the porch steps, his own weapons already cleaned and ready. Along with his sidearm, he'd retrieved a shotgun from his Gira coach gun with twin barrels that spoke of serious intent. "I've seen you birth a breached calf in a thunderstorm and nurse a dying foal back to health," Eli said quietly. "I've watched you work 18-hour days without complaint and face down armed men who came to intimidate you. You're stronger than you know, Clara." "That's different. That was protecting animals, protecting what's mine. This is protecting what's ours," Eli finished. "Protecting our future, our right to build something good in this world." Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his steady presence. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation they'd been preparing for all week, ever since word had come back from the territorial capital. The governor had reviewed Eli's case, examined the evidence that had been hidden for 2 years, and made his decision. Sheriff Eli Maddox was officially reinstated, with full authority to investigate corruption in the territory and arrest anyone involved in illegal land seizures. Harlan Creighton's reign of intimidation was about to end, but not without a fight. The news had spread quickly through Coyote Bend, dividing the community along predictable lines. Honest ranchers and townspeople rallied to Eli's support, while those who'd profited from Creighton's methods began making plans to protect their investments. Several families had already fled town, unwilling to be caught in the middle of what everyone knew was coming. But not everyone had run. Pete Morrison had arrived that morning with 3 of his most trusted hands, men who'd known Clara since she was a child and weren't about to let her face danger alone. Doc Patterson had sent word that his house was available as a medical station if needed, and even the preacher had offered to help, though his assistance would be more spiritual than tactical. "Riders coming," Pete called from his position near the barn, where he'd been keeping watch. Clara and Eli rose quickly, weapons in hand, but relaxed when they recognized the approaching figures. Tom Miller, who ran the general store, was leading a group of 6 men all armed, all determined to see justice done. "Sheriff Maddox," Tom said, dismounting and tipping his hat to Clara. "Miss Boone, we came to see if you need additional hands for tomorrow." "I appreciate the offer," Eli replied, "but this isn't your fight. No sense in good men dying for." "Begging your pardon, Sheriff," interrupted Jake Stevens, the blacksmith, "but it is our fight. Creighton's been bleeding this territory dry for years. If you're finally calling him to account, we want to be part of it." "Besides," added Charlie West, whose small ranch bordered Clara's to the north, "we all know what happens if you fail. Creighton won't stop with Clara's land. He'll keep taking until there's nothing left for honest folks." Eli studied the faces of the men before him, weathered by sun and wind, marked by years of hard work and harder choices. These weren't professional gunfighters or trained lawmen. They were farmers and storekeepers, fathers and husbands, who'd decided that some things were worth fighting for. "All right," Eli said finally, "but we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. The goal is to arrest Creighton and his men, not to start a war." "What if they don't come quietly?" Pete asked. "Then we do whatever's necessary to protect innocent lives," Eli replied. "But I'm hoping it won't come to that." As the men settled in around the ranch, checking their weapons and discussing positions, Clara found herself watching Eli with new eyes. The badge on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight, but it was more than the symbol of authority that transformed him. It was the way he carried himself, straight and sure, every inch the lawman he'd been trained to be. "You look different with that badge on," she said when they had a moment alone. "Feel different too," Eli admitted. "For 2 years, I've been running from who I used to be. Feels good to stop running." "What happens after tomorrow, assuming we all survive it?" Eli's smile was soft and full of promise. After tomorrow, we build the life we talked about. You and me, this ranch, maybe a family someday if we're blessed enough. Clara felt her heart skip. They'd talked around the subject of marriage, but this was the first time either had mentioned children. You want children? With you? More than anything, Eli said, reaching for her hand. I want little girls with your courage and boys with your stubborn streak. I want to teach them to ride and shoot and stand up for what's right. And I want little ones with your gentle hands and kind heart, Clara replied, squeezing his fingers. But first, we have to make sure there's a world worth bringing them into. As evening deepened into night, the men took turns keeping watch while others tried to rest. Clara found sleep impossible, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. She'd faced danger before, but never anything like this, never a deliberate confrontation with men who killed for money and power. Around midnight, she gave up trying to sleep and went to check on Shadow. The stallion had grown calmer during his recovery, but he still carried the wildness in his eyes, the knowledge that freedom was just a fence and an open gate away. Tomorrow you can go back to your herd, Clara murmured, stroking his neck. No more stalls, no more being dependent on humans for food and water. You'll be free again. Talking to yourself, or to him. Eli's voice came from the barn doorway. Both, I suppose. Clara turned to face him. I keep thinking about what freedom costs. Shadow gave up his freedom to heal, and now he gets it back. But what about us? What do we give up if we win tomorrow? What do you mean? Clara gestured around the barn, then toward the house where armed men waited for dawn. This peaceful life, this quiet existence, it's over whether we win or lose. If we lose, Creighton takes everything. If we win, you'll be sheriff again, with all the responsibilities that brings. Either way, everything changes. Eli moved closer, taking her hands in his. Are you having second thoughts about us? About what we're building together? No, Clara said firmly. Never about that. I keep thinking about my parents. They had 12 years together before the fever took Mama. 12 years of quiet happiness, of building something good together. I used to think that wasn't enough, that they deserved more time. And now I think maybe 12 years of real happiness is worth more than a lifetime of existing without it. Clara looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. If tomorrow is all we get, Eli, I want you to know it's been enough. Knowing you, loving you's been enough. Eli pulled her against him, holding her tight. Tomorrow isn't all we get, he said fiercely. I didn't find you just to lose you. We're going to have our 12 years and 20 more besides. Promise me something, Clara whispered against his chest. Anything. If things go wrong tomorrow, if Creighton's men get the upper hand, don't try to be a hero. Don't throw your life away for mine. Eli pulled back to look at her, his grey eyes serious. I can't promise that, Clara. If it comes down to choosing between your life and mine. It won't, Clara interrupted, because we're smarter than that and better prepared than they think. But if it does, I need to know you'll choose to live. The territory needs good lawmen, and I need to know that justice doesn't die with us. Eli was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. Finally he nodded. All right, but only if you promise me the same thing. If I fall tomorrow, you don't do anything foolish trying to avenge me. You get out, you survive, you live the life we planned. I promise, Clara said. Though they both knew it was a promise neither might be able to keep. They stood together in the quiet barn, surrounded by the familiar scents of hay and horses, holding each other as if they could somehow make time stop. Outside, the wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying the promise of dawn and whatever it might bring. I should try to get some rest, Clara said eventually. So should I, long day ahead. But neither moved to leave. They stood wrapped in each other's arms, storing up memories against an uncertain future, until Pete's voice called softly from the yard. Sheriff, Miss Clara, someone's coming. They grabbed their weapons and hurried outside, where Pete and the other men had taken defensive positions around the ranch buildings. In the distance, a single rider approached at an easy pace too, casual for an attack, but still potentially dangerous. As the figure drew closer, Clara recognized him, young Billy Henderson, who worked at the telegraph office in town. The boy looked exhausted and frightened, but he kept coming until he reached the edge of Clara's yard. "Sheriff Maddox," Billy called out, "I got a message for you, from the territorial capital." Eli stepped forward, motioning for the others to hold their positions. "What's the message, son?" Billy's voice shook as he delivered the news. "Governor's sending federal marshals to help, Sheriff. Should be here by noon tomorrow. But that ain't all. Creighton got word somehow. He's called in men from 3 territories. Word is he's got near 40 guns, riding for Coyote Bend." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. 40 men against the dozen they'd managed to gather, odds that would challenge even experienced fighters, let alone the mix of ranchers and townspeople who'd volunteered to help. "When are they expected to arrive?" Eli asked. "Sunrise, Sheriff. Maybe sooner." Clara felt her stomach drop. Federal marshals at noon. Creighton's army at dawn. It would be 6 hours of holding their ground against overwhelming odds, assuming the marshals actually arrived on schedule. "Billy," Eli said gently, "you ride back to town and tell anyone who's staying to lock their doors and keep their heads down. This is going to get ugly before it gets better." After the boy rode away, the men gathered around Eli for final instructions. Clara listened as he assigned positions, established fallback points, and reminded everyone that their goal was survival, not glory. "Remember," Eli said as they prepared to take their positions, "we're not trying to win a war. We just need to hold out until help arrives. Stay smart, stay alive, and let justice take its course." As the men dispersed to their assigned spots, Clara found herself alone with Eli one last time. Tomorrow would bring violence and chaos, but tonight, for these last few hours, they could hold on to the peace they'd found together. "Whatever happens," Clara said, checking her father's rifle one final time, "I want you to know I'd make the same choices again. All of them." "Even the stubborn ones?" Eli asked with a small smile. "Especially the stubborn ones." They kissed then, long and sweet, storing up the taste and feel of each other against whatever the dawn might bring. When they broke apart, both were smiling despite the fear that gripped their hearts. "See you on the other side, Sheriff," Clara said. "Count on it," Eli replied. As they took their positions around the ranch, waiting for an enemy that would arrive with the sun, Clara touched the stock of her father's rifle and whispered a prayer to whatever powers watched over stubborn women and the men brave enough to love them. The stage was set. By sunset tomorrow, Coyote Bend would be free or it would be lost. But either way, Clara Boone would face her fate with courage, with love, and with the knowledge that some things were worth any risk to protect. The deed to Clara's land lay folded in her shirt pocket, pressed close to her heart as she crouched behind the water trough with her father's rifle ready. The document was more than just legal proof of ownership. It represented 3 generations of Boone's sweat and dreams, the foundation upon which her entire identity had been built. Today, one way or another, its fate would be decided. Dawn came bloody red across the prairie, painting the eastern sky the color of warning. Clara counted the riders as they crested the hill. 38 men, all armed, all riding with the grim purpose of soldiers approaching a battlefield. At their head rode Harlan Creighton himself, a man Clara had never seen but recognized immediately from the stories. Tall and sharp-featured, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. "Remember," Eli called softly from his position near the barn, "let them make the first move. We're the law here now, and we do this right." Clara's heart hammered as Creighton's force spread out in a wide semicircle around her ranch buildings. They moved with practiced efficiency, cutting off escape routes and establishing fields of fire with the precision of men who'd done this before. But they stopped just outside rifle range, respecting the defensive positions Eli had chosen during the long night of preparation. Creighton himself rode forward alone, stopping in the middle of Clara's yard with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was older than Clara had expected, perhaps 60, but he sat his horse with the straight spine of someone half his age. "Sheriff Maddox," Creighton called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Eli emerged from cover behind the barn, his badge catching the morning light. "The only thing here that belongs to you, Creighton, is the arrest warrant I'm about to serve." Creighton's laugh was cold as winter wind. "You always were naive, Eli. Did you really think pinning on that badge again would change anything? Did you think the territorial governor's blessing would protect you from the consequences of your choices?" "I think justice has been delayed long enough," Eli replied steadily. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and attempted murder. You have the right to surrender peacefully." "Surrender?" Creighton's eyes glittered with amusement. "My dear Sheriff, I have 40 armed men, and you have what? A dozen farmers and shopkeepers. The mathematics don't favor surrender." Clara felt anger surge through her at his casual dismissal of the brave men who'd chosen to stand with them. These weren't professional fighters, but they were good people defending their homes and their futures. That counted for something. "You're forgetting something, Creighton," Eli said. "I have the law on my side, and federal marshals are on their way as we speak." "Are they?" Creighton pulled a piece of paper from his coat and held it up. "According to this telegraph message I intercepted, those marshals have been delayed indefinitely. Some trouble with their transportation, I'm told. Tragic, really." Clara's blood ran cold. Without federal backup, their small force wouldn't last an hour against Creighton's small army. But Eli's voice remained steady, betraying none of the desperation Clara knew he must be feeling. "Then I guess we'll have to settle this the old-fashioned way," Eli said. "Indeed we will." Creighton's smile was sharp as a blade. "Miss Boone, I know you're listening. This is your last chance to be reasonable. Sign over your land deed, and your friends can walk away from this alive." Clara stood up slowly, her rifle held ready, but not aimed directly at Creighton. She could feel the eyes of 40 men focused on her, could sense the tension radiating from her own allies as they waited to see what she would do. "My answer is the same as it's always been," Clara called back. "This land isn't for sale." "Then you're sentencing good men to die for your stubbornness," Creighton replied. "Their blood will be on your hands." "No," Clara said firmly, "their blood will be on yours. These men chose to be here. They chose to stand up to a bully who's been terrorizing honest folks for too long. That's not stubbornness, Mr. Creighton. That's courage." Creighton's expression darkened. "Courage is a luxury you can't afford, Miss Boone. Buck, make your position clear." Buck Henley spurred his horse forward, flanked by 2 of his most dangerous-looking companions. Clara recognized the pale-eyed man from their previous encounter, and the third rider looked like he'd stepped out of a nightmare scarred and missing 2 fingers on his gun hand, but apparently still deadly enough to earn Creighton's trust. "Last warning, Sheriff," Buck called out. "You and your people ride out now, and nobody has to die today." "Can't do that, Buck," Eli replied. "I've got warrants to serve and justice to uphold. That's what the badge means." Buck's hand moved to his gun butt. "Then I reckon we got ourselves a problem." The tension stretched tight as a piano wire, everyone waiting for someone to make the first fatal move. Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could smell the acrid scent of fear sweat mixing with the clean morning air. Then everything happened at once. The pale-eyed man went for his gun first, clearing leather with the smooth speed of a professional killer. Eli's response was faster, his Colt appearing in his hand as if by magic, spitting fire and thunder across the yard. The pale-eyed man pitched backward from his saddle, his shot going wild into the morning sky. The sound of that first gunshot shattered the morning like breaking glass, and suddenly the yard erupted in violence. Creighton's men charged forward with wild yells, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth as they sought to overwhelm the defenders through sheer force of numbers. Clara sighted down her rifle barrel and squeezed the trigger, feeling the weapon buck against her shoulder as the shot took one of the charging riders clean out of his saddle. Around her, the other defenders opened fire, their weapons speaking in a ragged chorus that temporarily checked the charge. But there were too many of them. For every man Clara and her allies put down, 2 more took his place. Within moments, the attackers had reached the ranch buildings, and the battle devolved into a desperate close-quarters fight. Clara worked the lever of her rifle with mechanical precision, loading and firing as fast as she could manage. A rider bore down on her position, his gun aimed at her heart. But Pete Morrison's shotgun boomed from somewhere to her left, and the man tumbled from his horse in a spray of blood. "Clara, fall back to the house!" Eli's voice cut through the chaos, but Clara couldn't see him through the gun smoke and swirling dust. She grabbed her ammunition and scrambled toward the relative safety of her front porch, feeling bullets whine past her head as she ran. Jake Stevens, the blacksmith, was already there, bleeding from a graze across his forehead, but still fighting. He helped Clara up the porch steps, and together they took cover behind the heavy wooden railings her grandfather had built to last. "How many we lost?" Clara gasped, trying to count muzzle flashes in the chaos. "Charlie West's down," Jake replied grimly, reloading his rifle. "Don't know about the others." Clara's heart clenched. Charlie had been one of her closest neighbors, a good man with a wife and 3 children waiting for him at home. But there was no time to grieve. Creighton's men were regrouping for another charge, and this time they wouldn't be caught by surprise. Through the smoke and confusion, Clara caught a glimpse of Eli near the barn, his back pressed against the wall as he faced off against 3 of Creighton's gunmen. His badge gleamed silver in the morning light, and even in the midst of battle, he moved with the calm authority of a man born to wear it. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and Clara could see more of Creighton's men moving to surround him. The deed in her pocket seemed to burn against her chest of this violence, all of this death, because she'd refused to give up the land that meant everything to her. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was any piece of ground worth the lives of good men? Was her stubborn pride worth Jake Stevens bleeding beside her, worth Charlie West lying still in the dust of her yard? Then she saw Buck Henley raise his rifle, taking careful aim at Eli's exposed back, and all doubt vanished. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about the right of good people to make a stand against evil, to choose love over fear and justice over profit. Clara brought her father's rifle to her shoulder and sent Buck Henley diving for cover with a shot that splintered the barn wall inches from his head. As he scrambled for safety, Clara worked the lever and fired again, this time aiming for the men closing in on Eli. The fight was far from over, but as Clara watched Eli spin and fire with deadly precision, she felt a fierce pride burn in her chest. Whatever happened next, they were making their stand together, fighting for something worth having. The deed in her pocket wasn't just paper and ink, it was a promise that good people could build something lasting in a hard world if they had the courage to defend it. Eli's badge caught the morning sun as he pinned it firmly to his vest, the silver star gleaming with renewed purpose. The tarnish had been polished away during the long night of preparation, and now it shone like a beacon of hope in the smoke and chaos of battle. The moment he secured the badge, something fundamental shifted in Eli's bearing. The careful restraint he'd maintained for 2 years fell away, replaced by the cold competence of a lawman who'd found his calling again. His movements became more decisive, his aim more deadly, his commands more authoritative. "Tom, Jake, cover the left flank." Eli's voice cut through the gunfire with the ring of absolute authority. "Pete, watch the barn they're trying to circle around." Clara watched in amazement as the scattered defenders responded to Eli's leadership, their desperate fight transforming into something more organized and effective. Here was the sheriff she'd only glimpsed in moments of crisis, the man who'd earned his badge through skill and courage rather than political connections. But even Eli's restored confidence couldn't change the mathematics of their situation. For every one of Creighton's men they put down, 2 more seemed to take his place. The ammunition was running low. Several of their allies were wounded, and the enemy was pressing closer with each charge. Harlan Creighton himself had dismounted and taken position behind Clara's water trough, directing his men with the calm efficiency of a general commanding troops. He seemed utterly unconcerned by the bullets flying around him, as if he'd orchestrated so many such battles that violence held no terror for him anymore. "Sheriff Maddox," Creighton called out during a brief lull in the firing. "You're fighting a losing battle. Surrender now, and I'll make your deaths quick." "The only surrender here will be yours, Creighton," Eli shouted back, ejecting spent shells from his revolver. "Justice has been delayed, not denied." Creighton's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "Justice? You still believe in fairy tales, don't you? Let me show you what justice looks like in the real world." The cattle baron raised his arm, and suddenly Clara understood what was about to happen. She'd seen that signal before, during a cattle drive, when the trail boss wanted to scatter a herd. Creighton wasn't just ordering another charge, he was ordering his men to burn everything down. "Fire!" Creighton shouted. "Burn them out!" Several of his men produced torches and began advancing toward the ranch buildings. Clara felt her heart stop as she realized what they intended. Her home, her barn, everything her family had built over 3 generations, all of it would be ash within the hour. But before the first torch could reach its target, the thunder of hoofbeats announced new arrivals on the battlefield. Clara looked up to see a line of riders cresting the hill from the east, moving at full gallop toward the fight. For a moment, her heart soared. Perhaps the federal marshals had arrived early after all. Then she recognized the lead rider, and her blood ran cold. It was Sheriff Marcus Webb, Eli's former boss, the man who'd betrayed his oath and tried to have Eli killed. He rode at the head of 20 men, all wearing badges, all armed for war. "Well, well," Creighton called out with obvious satisfaction. "Look who's arrived just in time. Sheriff Webb, I trust you have warrants for these outlaws." Webb reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his pale eyes scanning the battlefield with cold calculation. He was a lean man with graying hair and the kind of face that revealed nothing of the thoughts behind it. "I have warrants," Webb said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "But not for the people you think." Creighton's confident smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" Webb reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Harlan Creighton, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, murder, and corruption of public officials. These other warrants are for your known associates." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat. Creighton stared at Webb, as if the sheriff had suddenly sprouted wings, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. "Have you lost your mind, Webb?" Creighton snarled. "I own you. I've been paying you for years." "You were paying me," Webb corrected calmly. "But circumstances change. The territorial governor made me a very generous offer for my cooperation in cleaning up this territory. It seems my testimony about your activities is worth more than your monthly payments." Clara felt the world tilt around her. Webb corrupt, venal Marcus Webb had apparently decided to change sides. But why? What could possibly motivate a man like that to suddenly develop a conscience? The answer came when she saw another figure riding up behind Webb's posse. Even at a distance, Clara recognized the unmistakable bearing of federal authority. This had to be one of the marshals who'd been delayed. Apparently, they'd been delayed only long enough to gather additional evidence and flip Webb's allegiance. "You're making a mistake, Webb," Creighton said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You know what I can do to people who cross me." "I know what you used to be able to do," Webb replied. "But your network is finished, Creighton. Half your purchased officials are already in custody, and the other half are racing to make deals with the prosecutor. The smart money is on cooperation, not loyalty." Eli had emerged from cover during this exchange, his own weapon trained on Creighton, but his attention focused on Webb. Clara could see the war of emotions playing out on his face, the desire for revenge warring with his respect for the law and the badge he wore. "Marcus," Eli said quietly, his voice carrying across the sudden stillness, "you cost me 2 years of my life. Good people died because of your corruption." Webb met his former deputy's gaze without flinching. "I know what I did, Eli. I know what it cost. But I can't change the past. I can only try to make the future better." "Why should anyone trust you now?" "Because," Webb said simply, I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of wondering when Creighton's paranoia would decide I was a liability rather than an asset. Sometimes the devil you know becomes more dangerous than the one you don't. Creighton had heard enough. With a roar of rage, he drew his gun and fired at Webb, but the shot went wide as his horse shied at the sudden noise. That single gunshot shattered the temporary ceasefire, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. But this time, the battle was different. Webb's men had surrounded Creighton's force, cutting off their escape routes and turning the hunters into the hunted. Caught between Eli's defenders and Webb's superior numbers, Creighton's hired guns found themselves in an untenable position. Some threw down their weapons immediately, preferring capture to certain death. Others tried to fight their way out, only to be cut down by the disciplined fire of Webb's posse. Buck Henley made a desperate break for the hills, but Pete Morrison's shotgun ended his flight 50 yards from the barn. Within minutes, it was over. The surviving members of Creighton's force were either dead or in custody, their weapons scattered across Clara's yard like deadly seeds that would never sprout. Creighton himself stood alone in the middle of the carnage, his silver hair disheveled, his expensive clothes torn and blood-stained. He still held his gun, but it was pointed at the grounded gesture of defeat rather than defiance. "It's finished, Harlan," Eli said, approaching with his weapon drawn but not aimed. "Drop the gun and surrender." For a moment, Clara thought Creighton might comply. The old man's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his defeat had finally settled upon them, but then his eyes hardened with a final spark of malice. "If I can't have this territory," Creighton snarled, "then nobody can." He raised his gun toward Clara, his intent clear in his twisted features. But before he could fire, Eli's Colt spoke with final authority. Creighton spun and fell, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers to land in the dust of the yard he'd tried so hard to claim. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Clara stood on her porch, her father's rifle still clutched in white-knuckled hands, hardly daring to believe it was truly over. Around the yard, wounded men groaned and called for help, but the immediate danger had passed. Eli walked slowly toward Clara, his badge gleaming in the morning sun that had risen on chaos, but now shone on justice restored. When he reached the porch steps, he looked up at her with eyes that held exhaustion, relief, and something deeper, the satisfaction of a man who'd finally made peace with his past. "It's done," he said simply. Clara set down her rifle and flew down the steps into his arms, feeling the solid reality of his embrace drive away the last of her fear. They were alive, they were together, and the land that meant everything to her was safe. The badge pressed against her cheek as she held him, but it no longer felt like a barrier between them. Instead, it felt like what it had always been meant to be, symbol of protection, of justice, of the promise that good people could triumph over evil if they had the courage to fight for what was right. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied, and in the growing light of a new day, Clara and Eli began to build the future they'd fought so hard to secure. The new brand was struck for the first time on a cool morning in October, 6 months after the guns fell silent in Clara's yard. The iron bore both the traditional Boone star and a new addition, the letter M intertwined with the B, representing the merger of two lives into something stronger than either had been alone. Clara held the brand steady as Eli applied it to the flank of a young bull, their movements synchronized by months of working as true partners. The Boone Maddox ranch was thriving under their joint leadership, with new cattle, repaired fences, and the kind of prosperity that came from honest work, fairly rewarded. "That's the last of them," Eli said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the autumn chill. "Come spring, we'll have the finest herd in 3 territories. And the hardest working sheriff," Clara added with a smile. "How many hours did you put in at the courthouse this week?" "Not nearly as many as I wanted to spend here with you," Eli replied, pulling her close for a quick kiss. "But the territory's almost clean now. Most of Creighton's network is behind bars, and the new judges are honest men who won't be bought." The transformation of the territory had been remarkable to witness. With Creighton's corruption exposed and his network dismantled, Honest ranchers and businessmen had emerged from years of intimidation to reclaim their rightful place in society. Trade flourished, new families arrived to settle on available land, and the kind of community Clara had always dreamed of was finally taking root. Sheriff Marcus Webb had proven surprisingly effective in his new role as a reformed lawman. His intimate knowledge of Creighton's operations had been invaluable in rooting out the last pockets of corruption, and his testimony had sent dozens of conspirators to prison. It wasn't redemption exactly, too much damage had been done for that, but it was a genuine attempt to make amends. "Speaking of the courthouse," Eli said, producing a folded document from his vest pocket, "Judge Patterson asked me to give you this." Clara unfolded the paper and gasped. It was the deed to the Morrison Spread Pete's ranch, which he'd decided to sell now that his arthritis was making ranch work too difficult for him. "He's giving us first option to buy," Eli explained. "Says he'd rather see the land go to people who'll treat it right than to strangers who might not understand its history." Clara looked out across the rolling hills that had been her world for 26 years. The prospect of doubling their holdings was exciting, but it also felt like a tremendous responsibility. Land wasn't just property, it was legacy, heritage, the foundation upon which future generations would build their dreams. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," Eli said carefully, "that Pete's right about us understanding the land's history, and I think we've got enough saved to make a fair offer without overextending ourselves." "That's not what I meant," Clara said, touching his arm. "I meant, what do you think about building something this big, about committing to a future that could take decades to fully realize?" Eli's smile was soft and full of promise. "I think I've been ready for that kind of future since the day I watched you risk your life to save an injured stallion. The question is whether you're ready to share it with a reformed sheriff who still has to travel the territory on official business." Clara's answer was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They looked up to see a familiar figure riding toward them, Shadow, the black stallion they'd nursed back to health, leading his small herd across the pasture. The magnificent horse had remained free as promised, but he'd taken to grazing near the ranch boundaries, as if the kindness he'd received had created an invisible bond. "Look at that," Clara murmured, watching the wild horses move with fluid grace across her land. "He could go anywhere, but he chooses to stay close." "Maybe he found something worth staying for," Eli suggested, his meaning clear. Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder. They'd been married 2 months now, in a simple ceremony performed by the preacher with half the territory in attendance. The wedding had been a celebration not just of their love, but of the community's survival and renewal. "I've been thinking about what Pete said," Clara said, "about understanding the land's history. We know what happened here, who fought for it, who died protecting it. But what about the history we haven't written yet?" "What do you mean?" Clara turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with a mixture of hope and determination. "I mean children, Eli. Little ones who grow up knowing that good people fought to build something lasting here. Who learn to ride and rope and brand cattle, but who'll also learn about justice and courage and standing up for what's right." Eli's breath caught. They'd talked about children before, but always in abstract terms. Someday, maybe, if they were blessed. This felt different, more immediate, more real. "Are you telling me something I should know?" he asked gently. Clara's smile was radiant. "I'm telling you that Doc Patterson thinks we might have our first little Boone Maddox by next summer, and I'm asking if you're ready to be a father as well as a sheriff and a rancher." For a moment, Eli couldn't speak. The magnitude of what Clara was offering, not just a child, but a complete life, a family, a legacy that would outlast both of them, was almost overwhelming. "I'm ready," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been ready since the moment you told me you didn't want different women." They held each other in the autumn sunshine, surrounded by the land they'd fought to protect and the future they were building together. In the distance, Shadow and his herd grazed peacefully, living proof that wild things could choose to stay when they found something worth having. The brand in Clara's hands was still warm from its first use, the metal holding the heat of creation and promise. Tomorrow they would use it again, and the day after that, and for all the years to come. Each mark would tell the story of the Boone Maddox ranch, of two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances and built something lasting from courage and determination. As the sun climbed higher, painting the prairie grass gold and green, Clara and Eli began making plans for their expanded ranch, their growing family, and the community they would help nurture. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but they would face them together, just as they'd faced everything else. The territory was healing, justice had been restored, and love had triumphed over fear. In a world that often seemed determined to reward the ruthless and punish the good, Clara and Eli had found proof that sometimes courage and decency could prevail. As they walked back toward the house for lunch, Clara caught sight of something that made her smile. There, on the fence post where Eli had once left his carved wooden horse for young Tommy Morrison, sat a new creation, a tiny wooden cradle, perfectly detailed despite its miniature size. "When did you make that?" she asked, pointing to the carving. Eli's cheeks reddened slightly. "Last night, after you fell asleep, thought maybe our little one might like to have something special, even if it's just for decoration." Clara picked up the tiny cradle, marveling at the craftsmanship. Every curve was perfect, every joint seamless, the wood polished to a warm honey glow. It was beautiful and hopeful and utterly impractical, and she loved it completely. "It's perfect," she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "Absolutely perfect." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the land they'd claimed as their own, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a lonely woman, convinced that love was not meant for someone like her. Eli had been a broken man running from a past he couldn't escape. Now they were husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word, expecting their first child and planning a future that seemed limitless in its possibilities. It hadn't been easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was, but every challenge had been worth facing for the life they'd built together. "Regrets?" Eli asked, as if reading her thoughts. "About what?" "Any of it. The fighting, the danger, the complications that came with loving a man with a complicated past." Clara considered the question seriously. There had been moments of terror, times when she'd wondered if standing up to Creighton would cost them everything. But looking at Eli now, seeing the peace that had settled over his features since he'd reclaimed his badge and his purpose, she knew her answer. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Not about fighting for what we believed in, not about choosing love over safety, not about any of it. The only thing I regret is that it took us so long to find each other. We found each other exactly when we were supposed to," Eli replied. "Not a moment sooner, not a moment later. Everything that happened before, all the loneliness, all the running, all the fear, it was just preparing us for this." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara thought about the prairie stars under which their love story had truly begun. The same constellations that had witnessed her father's courtship of her mother, that had watched over 3 generations of Boones as they built their legacy on this harsh but beautiful land. Now those stars would witness something new, the beginning of the Boone Maddox line, a family that would carry forward the best of both their heritages. Children who would grow up knowing they were loved, protected, and part of something larger than themselves. "I love you, Eli Maddox," Clara said, the words carrying all the weight of promise and commitment they'd spoken at their wedding. "I love you too, Clara Boone Maddox," he replied, "more than I ever thought possible." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the night settle over their land, planning their tomorrow while cherishing their today. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound wild and lonely, but somehow comforting in its familiarity. This was home, this was family, this was the life they'd chosen and fought for and won. And it was only the beginning.